Kang Min-sik walked out of prison after 10 years, but his freedom came at a deadly cost. Ji-ain, the wife who had waited for him, had no idea that the man she once loved carried a secret, one that would infect her body, destroy her future, and push her toward an unthinkable act of revenge. Kang Min-sik stepped out of the prison gates into the crisp autumn air, taking his first breath of freedom in 10 years. The world outside had changed. Buildings were taller, streets were busier, and people moved with a rhythm he no longer understood. He had spent a decade behind bars for fraud and assault, crimes that had once defined him. Now he was supposed to be a reformed man, ready to start over. But deep down, he knew he'd only learned how to hide his true nature better. He had nowhere else to go, so he returned to the only place that had ever felt like home, the apartment where his wife Ji-yeon still lived. He hadn't seen her in years, their communication reduced to a few letters during his time in prison. She had stopped visiting him after the first year, her words growing colder with each passing month. He couldn't blame her. He had left her to raise their son alone while he rotted in a cell, paying for his mistakes. Standing outside the apartment door, he hesitated before knocking. He had imagined this moment countless times, picturing Ji-yeon's reaction. Would she cry? Would she slam the door in his face? Would she even recognize him after all these years? The door opened slowly, and there she was, older, thinner, and with a look in her eyes that he couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was something in between, like a woman who had been forced to move on but had never truly forgotten. She didn't invite him in right away. Instead, she studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. He knew she was debating whether to let him back into her life. Finally, she stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The apartment was smaller than he remembered, but it was clean, organized, evidence of the life she had built in his absence. Their son was at school, unaware that his father had returned. Min-sik placed his bag down, scanning the room for any sign that another man had taken his place. There was none. That gave him a small sense of satisfaction. Ji-yeon sat across from him, keeping her distance. Her questions came quickly, as if she had rehearsed them in her head. Where had he been staying? What were his plans? Did he expect things to go back to the way they were? He answered carefully, telling her what she wanted to hear. He had changed. He wanted a fresh start. He wanted to be a husband and father again. She listened in silence, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. He could tell she didn't trust him, but she didn't throw him out either. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was love buried beneath years of resentment. Either way, she allowed him to stay, setting one condition: he had to prove he was worthy of being in their lives again. Min-sik agreed without hesitation. What she didn't know was that he had already brought destruction back into her life. Ji-yeon's life had settled into a routine before Min-sik's return. She had spent years rebuilding everything he had shattered, creating a stable home for herself and their son. The past was something she had tried to leave behind, though it still lingered in the quiet moments when she was alone. Having him back disrupted everything. At first, she convinced herself that giving him a second chance was the right thing to do. People could change, she thought. Maybe prison had forced him to reflect, to become a better person. But as the weeks passed, doubt crept in. Min-sik slipped back into the household with unsettling ease. He moved as if he still belonged there, as if the years apart had been nothing more than a brief pause. He didn't ask about her struggles, never once apologized for the pain he had caused. Instead, he acted entitled, expecting her to welcome him without question. Though he played the role of a reformed man in public, behind closed doors, she saw glimpses of the old Min-sik, the manipulation, the selfishness, the quiet anger when things didn't go his way. Then, the sickness began. At first, it was just fatigue. Ji-yeon brushed it off as stress, telling herself she was simply overwhelmed by the changes in her life. But then came the fevers, the night sweats, the aching joints that made even the simplest tasks unbearable. She ignored it for as long as she could, unwilling to acknowledge that something might be seriously wrong. But when she started losing weight rapidly, When her skin took on a sickly pallor and her strength drained away, she had no choice but to seek medical help. The doctor ran tests, asking questions that made her uneasy. Had she experienced any recent health risks? Had she engaged in any unsafe behavior? She answered honestly, saying she had been faithful to one man her entire life. When the results came back, she felt the world tilt beneath her feet. HIV positive. The words didn't make sense at first. She had always been careful. She had always trusted that, despite everything, Min-Sik had never put her in danger. But now, reality crashed down with unbearable weight. There was only one explanation. Min-Sik had infected her. The shock turned into a desperate need for answers. When she confronted him, his reaction was colder than she expected. He denied it at first, accusing her of looking for someone to blame. But she saw the flicker of guilt in his expression, the way his eyes darted away. He had known. He had brought this into their home, into her body, without a single warning. The betrayal was worse than anything he had done before. She could feel her future slipping away. All the years she had spent fighting to move forward, all the sacrifices she had made, they were worthless now. Her body, her health, her life itself had been stolen by the man she had once loved, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that she could never forgive him. Ji-yeon stopped recognizing herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked hollow, her skin stretched too thin over fragile bones. The light in her eyes had faded, replaced by something darker: anger, grief, and something even more dangerous brewing beneath the surface. She had spent years trying to be strong, holding her life together despite everything Min-Sik had done. But this was unforgivable. Days turned into weeks, and her condition worsened. The medication she was prescribed came with its own set of problems: nausea, dizziness, and exhaustion so deep she sometimes wondered if she would ever feel normal again. Every pill she swallowed was a reminder of what Min-Sik had done to her, of the irreversible damage he had caused. She had once imagined growing old, watching her son graduate, traveling to places she had only seen in books. Now, all of those dreams had been stripped away. Min-Sik continued living in their home as if nothing had changed. He never apologized, never acknowledged what he had done. Instead, he acted like she was the problem, like her illness was some unfortunate inconvenience that had nothing to do with him. He went out often, disappearing for hours without explanation. Ji-yeon suspected he had other women, that he was repeating the same cycle of destruction somewhere else. The thought made her sick, but not with sadness. What she felt now was rage. She started researching. Late at night, when sleep refused to come, she sat in front of the computer reading about cases similar to hers. She learned about people who had knowingly transmitted HIV, about the legal consequences they had faced. Some had been sentenced to prison. Others had walked free, their victims left to suffer alone. She read every detail, absorbing the information, feeling a fire ignite inside her. The law could punish him, but would it be enough? Would he truly suffer the way she had? Would he wake up every morning with the same crushing weight on his chest, knowing his future had been stolen? The answer was clear. No prison sentence, no fine, no courtroom judgment could make him understand the depth of his betrayal. A dark thought took root in her mind, one she could no longer ignore. If the justice system wouldn't destroy him, she would. At first, it was just a fleeting idea, a whisper in the back of her mind. But as the days passed, it grew louder, more persistent. She imagined different ways it could happen. A staged accident. Too risky. An overdose. He barely took medication. Poison. That seemed the easiest. He trusted her enough to eat the food she prepared. She could mix something into his meals, something slow and untraceable. The thought didn't scare her. That was the most unsettling part. There was no guilt, no hesitation. Min-Sik had taken everything from her. It was only fair that she took everything from him in return. Ji-yeon moved carefully, making sure every step of her plan was executed without suspicion. She had always been a quiet woman, someone who never caused trouble, never raised her voice. That worked to her advantage now. No one would suspect her of anything. She wasn't the type. But deep inside she had already crossed the point of no return. Min-sik remained oblivious, moving through the house with the same arrogance he had always carried. He barely noticed her anymore, treating her as if she were nothing more than a shadow in the background. He came home late, smelled of perfume that wasn't hers, and left his phone face down on the table. A habit of a man who had something to hide. Ji-yeon no longer cared about his infidelity. She wasn't looking for answers anymore. She was waiting for the right moment. She spent days researching poisons, looking for something effective yet undetectable. A slow-acting toxin would be too risky. Min-sik might seek medical help, and if doctors intervened in time, he would survive. No. She needed something fast, something that would ensure he wouldn't get back up once he went down. Eventually she settled on a plan. The night was like any other. Min-sik returned home late, barely acknowledging Ji-yeon as he walked past her. She had already prepared his favorite meal, setting the table as she always did. If he noticed anything different, he didn't show it. He sat down, grabbed his chopsticks, and began eating without a second thought. Ji-yeon watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. Her own plate remained untouched. The poison worked quickly. Within minutes, Min-sik paused, his brow furrowing as he swallowed hard. His hand went to his throat, his movements becoming unsteady. His breath grew labored, his skin turning pale. He tried to stand but stumbled, his chair scraping against the floor. Ji-yeon remained seated, her hands folded in her lap as she watched him struggle. Panic set in as Min-sik realized something was terribly wrong. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. He collapsed onto the floor, his body convulsing. His hands clawed at his chest, at the air, at anything that could save him. But there was nothing. The realization hit him in those final moments. Ji-yeon had done this to him. The woman he had betrayed, manipulated, and discarded was now the one deciding his fate. Ji-yeon felt nothing as she watched him take his final breath. No fear, no regret, no triumph. Just a hollow emptiness that had settled deep inside her long ago. The sound of his body falling still was the only confirmation she needed. It was over. She didn't run. She didn't try to cover her tracks. Instead, she calmly picked up the phone and dialed the police. Her voice was steady as she confessed, as if she had simply completed a task that had been waiting to be done. When the officers arrived, they found her sitting beside his lifeless body, waiting. The trial of Kang Ji-yeon became one of the most talked about cases in South Korea. The media painted different versions of her. Some called her a cold-blooded murderer, while others saw her as a victim pushed beyond her limits. Public opinion was divided. There were those who believed she had taken justice into her own hands, punishing a man who had ruined her life. Others argued that, no matter what he had done, she had no right to decide when he should die. Her confession had left no room for debate. She never denied her actions, never tried to shift the blame. When asked why she did it, her answer was simple: "He took everything from me." Those words echoed throughout the courtroom, haunting and undeniable. The prosecution presented the case as premeditated murder, detailing how she had researched poisons and waited for the right moment to strike. The defense, however, painted a different picture: a woman broken by betrayal, a victim who had lost her future and had nothing left to live for. Despite the arguments in her favor, the law was clear. Ji-yeon was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Some thought it was too harsh, others thought it was too lenient. But for Ji-yeon, the length of the sentence didn't matter. She had already been handed a death sentence the moment Min-sik had infected her. The prison walls were just another cage, no different from the one she had already been trapped in. Her health deteriorated quickly behind bars. The stress of the trial, the lack of proper medical care, and the emotional weight of everything she had endured took its toll. Within a year, she had lost even more weight, her body growing weaker by the day. Fellow inmates spoke of how she barely spoke, how she spent most of her time staring out of the small window in her cell, as if looking for something that wasn't there. Word spread that her condition was worsening. Doctors estimated she had only a few years left to live. Some people petitioned for an early release on medical grounds, but it was denied. The system had made its decision she would spend whatever time she had left behind bars. In the end, Ji-yeon's story became a cautionary tale. Some saw it as a tragic example of how betrayal could destroy lives. Others saw it as proof that justice should never be left in the hands of the victims. But there was one undeniable truth. Min-sik had taken everything from her, and in the end she had taken everything from him. There was no happy ending, no redemption, just a quiet, fading existence, a woman waiting for time to run out. When she finally took her last breath in a cold prison cell, there was no one there to mourn her. The world moved on, as it always did, leaving behind nothing more than a story that people would tell, argue about, and eventually forget.